Hello and welcome back to the Smile and Save podcast. This is episode 12, and we're actually releasing this episode on Debt Awareness Week. So, a really important week for everyone involved in the financial sector. And we thought that this week would be a great opportunity to talk about problem debt, some of the stigma and taboo that surrounds debt in the UK, and ways that people can manage their debt and see a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel if they are struggling. So today we're joined by Paul Fox from the Money and Pension Service. Paul, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here.
Fantastic. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your role at the Money and Pension Service, and a bit about the Money and Pension Service in general?
Absolutely. The Money and Pension Service is what's called an arm's length government body. So we sit underneath the Department for Work and Pensions, and we have an overarching remit under statute to provide free, independent and impartial money and pensions guidance to anybody across the UK who needs it at whatever point in life they are at. That could be from financial education, steering people away from unsafe credit. It could be helping people in debt and people who are in the later stages of life and planning for retirement. My role, I lead the Money and Pension Service in the southwest of England as regional manager. And really my role at its core is about connecting our resources, our tools and our guidance and our knowledge into as many of those 5.5 or so million people down here in the southwest who could use that support to have a better relationship with money, really, Tom.
Perfect. Okay. Perfect guest to have for Debt Awareness Week this week then. So thank you very much for joining us. I guess we'll get started by talking about debt in general. So most people in the UK will need to borrow at some point throughout their lives for various different reasons. When can debt actually become a problem?
Well, let me give you a little bit of a wider picture of the sort of the UK's consumer debt problem, and then I'll focus in a little bit on when debt can become a problem. So relatively recent statistics, second half of 2023, the grand total of personal debt owed by the UK population stood at £1.84 trillion. Now, the majority of that was secured mortgage debt, but well in excess of £200 billion of that is unsecured consumer debt. We know, for example, that around about 30% of all credit card users report using the card for cost of living essentials. We know also that more than 10 million households in the UK are currently facing financial difficulties. And whilst the larger part of them, around 5.5 to 6 million, don't describe their hardships as severe, we know that 4.5 million UK households are seriously struggling to make ends meet at the moment. And to give you a flavour of the debt advice services that we fund, and we're not the only provider in the marketplace, but from April 23 to April of last year, we engaged 6,500,000 clients across debt advice services. So you can see the scale of the problem from that. So when can debt become a problem? It can actually become a problem for anybody at any point in their life. Let's make that absolutely clear. But I think it's fair to say that there are some core themes, if you like, some warning signs when individuals are starting to move into potentially debt crisis. So probably one of the most obvious warning signs of a debt crisis is when individuals have accumulated high levels of debt actually relative to their income. So this could manifest as what we call a high debt to income ratio, where debt obligations consume a significant portion of the disposable income of an individual. And when debt levels become unsustainable and exceed the ability of that individual to repay, that is an obvious warning sign of the onset of a debt crisis. We also know that, for example, the signs point to the difficulty of making minimum payments. So if somebody's struggling to make minimum payments on their debt obligations, it could be their credit cards, could be their loan installments, it could be the utilities. That is a clear indication of financial distress. And when individuals find themselves consistently unable to meet those financial obligations without borrowing more money or without resorting to credit, that might signify the presence of a debt crisis. And ignoring overdue payments or resorting to short-term fixes can exacerbate that problem, and it can lead to deeper financial trouble. Another area about credit to mention here is a persistent use of credit to cover expenses. So a reliance on credit cards or other lines of credit, buy now, pay later, or loans to cover an individual's everyday expenses, groceries, rent, utilities. That can also be a warning sign of a debt crisis. If an individual consistently resorts to borrowing money to maintain their standard of living, then it really does start to indicate an underlying financial instability. Using credit as a temporary solution to cash flow problems can very quickly spiral into a debt crisis if it's not addressed promptly. And I think that the fourth area that I would touch on as well, an indicative situation is a decreased savings and emergency funds situation. So if you've got some money put aside and you're starting to see a decline in your savings or your emergency funds, that can indicate that individuals are facing financial difficulties and might be on the brink of a debt crisis. So if, for example, your savings accounts are depleted or your emergency funds are non-existent, there might well be limited resources available to you to cope with unexpected expenses or disruptions to your income. So depleting savings to cover daily expenses can also exacerbate financial vulnerabilities, and that also can increase the risk of a debt crisis.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. So I guess a lot of those are, small things happening, but spiraling out of control.
Yes, yes,
So
very
yeah, I
much so.
guess keeping an eye out for those in the early stages is really important, right?
It is, it is important for individuals to keep a regular track on where their finances are. And, for many people, they're not very confident around money. And it's particularly true around debt that, and we'll move on to this, I think, a little bit later on in the podcast, but debt is a very difficult topic to talk about. And it's something that a lot of people will just bury their head in the sand about. So it does make it more difficult for them or their spouse or partner to actually sort of spot some of those early warning signs.
Yeah, no, we will get onto that in just a moment. Before we do, obviously at Serve and Protect Credit Union, we serve a range of different public sector services, the police, prison, military, fire and health services.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any trends relating to debt within those services that we support at Serve and Protect?
I think it's a little difficult to tease out statistical evidence in regard to those demographics, those sectors that Serve and Protect actually engage with as customers, because most of the data around debt advice tends to be at a national level, and you can't quite get those nuances. But saying that, anecdotally, there are things that I've observed over the last couple of years that it's probably worth mentioning. I did quite a lot of work with the Ministry of Defence looking to help improve the financial well-being of the wider armed forces community. And I've spoken to numerous officers and serving personnel at various regiments right across the region. And as an example, about 12 months ago, I went to the Duke of Gloucester barracks and did a financial brief for an hour in front of about 400 personnel. And the next morning, by the time I'd gotten back home to Dorset, the next morning, the major who'd invited me over dropped me an email and said that after I'd left at lunchtime, 5 serving personnel that day had approached their line officer to say, do you know what? I'm in financial difficulties and I've got some debt and I didn't know there was support available. So anecdotally, we're certainly seeing that out there. I think in the NHS as well, an interesting one is wellbeing champions. Now, a lot of NHS trusts, for example, are starting to set up networks of what they're calling well-being champions. So this is individuals who are doing a particular role within the trust, but on a voluntary basis, they're learning about supporting the well-being, not just financial well-being, but well-being across the board of their colleagues, a trusted shoulder to turn to, if you like. And I've had several NHS trusts approach me in the last 6 months to ask if I can come along and actually do some financial well-being training for those champions. Because what they're seeing is that colleagues are having conversations that they are struggling with their health, perhaps their mental health or their housing, but actually money and debt is starting to become part of those conversations because these things very much often don't sit as a standalone. And I think those two bits of anecdotal evidence are indicative, Tom, really, that the services that Serve and Protect actually provide a service to that customer base of yours. Whilst, as I say, again, we can't really tease out too many details about the public sector in that sense. But anecdotally, we know that there is a significant number of people across those people that you are serving, those customers you serve, who do currently have or are at risk of falling into problem debt.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess there's trends across every workforce, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, we do hear stories, anecdotal stories. So no, it's just good to back that up, really. Is there anything that makes some individuals or groups more vulnerable to experiencing problem debt than others?
Yes, I think you can say that there is, and we use a particular measure here at the Money and Pension Service that identifies people who need debt advice, and it also identifies those people who are at risk of needing it if their situation doesn't improve. During last year, around and about 15% of the adult population in the UK fell into this category. So that's around and about 8 million people. And what we do know is that individuals in particular circumstances and with certain characteristics tend to be overrepresented in the population who need debt advice compared to the UK population as a whole. So let me bring that to life a little bit for you. So some of those demographics who are overrepresented when it comes to needing debt advice, for example, are people under 35 years old. It could also be households with children and on low incomes. We know that about 3/4 of those households who are seeking debt advice, or rather those individuals who seek debt advice, come from a household where the income before tax is less than £30,000. We also know that around about 2/3 of the people who are looking for debt advice or are at risk of debt crisis come from homes that are rented from social or private landlords, with about 28 or so percent with their house on a mortgage. And we also know that people needing debt advice, the ethnic minority communities make up less than 20% of the adult population, but actually around 31% of individuals who are seeking debt help come from those communities. And also, as well, I think people needing debt advice also were more likely to have experienced an income shock in the last 2 or 3 years. So, that could be a redundancy, it could be a drop in earnings related to ill health, or some other significant life event. And yeah, we can definitely monitor that. Some people, for example, struggle with their reading. It might be that people struggle to speak on the phone because they're not very confident. It could be that there's been addiction issues or a relationship breakdown. All these sorts of things can be indicative of demographics who perhaps over-index on the requirement for debt advice. So it's something we have to be really careful to try and monitor and get an accurate as picture as possible as to where our help from the Money and Pension Service is to be best targeted.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I think that gives a lot of different things for particularly employers think about in terms of warning signs. And a lot of that does ring true to some research that we've just done from our membership, our annual
Yeah.
financial resilience survey, which will be published, I believe, next week as this goes out. So we'll make sure to link that in the description because that goes into a lot of detail there as well. So, as we say, this week is Debt Awareness Week. The theme of this year is breaking down that stigma. It's something that's talked about regularly. So, there seems to be growing stigma around debt in the UK. Why do you think people find it so difficult to talk about with their partners, friends, family?
Yeah, it can be a really heart-wrenching thing to see and to listen about. But there are a multitude of reasons, but I think that, underlying that is that the stigma of debt and its negative emotions can actually be pretty debilitating and actually can prevent people from seeking the help that they need to address their debt problem. The shame that some people fear and the fear of debt itself often leave people feeling very alone, very isolated, that they don't have anybody to talk to. And that often, we see that it often means people, they'll bury their head in the sand. They will, for example, only about 1 in 4 people who need to see a professional debt advisor will actually engage with a professional debt advisor. And for some of those people who make that initial contact, they will drop out of the system very quickly. Again, because those negative emotions can prevent them from going through that full journey to address their debt concerns. I don't want people to suffer in silence, Tom. I think that's, if there's any message that anybody picks up out of this podcast from my perspective, it's that, we can all get into problem debt at some point in our lives. I think most of us have probably had some form of financial difficulty at some point in our life. And, the key thing is, please don't suffer in silence. There is free regulated debt help available for anybody who needs it. And if somebody listening is feeling alone, or they're feeling isolated, or they just don't know who to turn to, and they feel they can't turn to their family or their partner or their spouse, then there are resources and services available to help them. And that's certainly one of the things that we're here to do at the Money and Pension Service.
Yeah, thanks for that, and we'll get into the support that the Money and Pension Service provide in a bit more detail in a moment as well. As I say, one of the aims of Debt Awareness Week is to help people to break down that stigma and start conversations about debt.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for how people can do this if they're listening and potentially struggling?
Yes, I think so. I think, each of us will always take a different approach when we've got financial challenges in life. But I think, broadly speaking, if you are wanting to have that conversation with a partner or a spouse, for example, there are some things to think about before that conversation that I very much believe will help people have a more positive conversation. So I think the first thing, Tom, is to get clear on your debt situation. So before you approach your loved one, gather your thoughts and your facts so that you're ready to answer any questions that they might have about your debt. Taking that time to gather your thoughts, understand exactly where you currently stand, it will help you bring some clarity. It will help you take stock of your current financial position. How much money do you owe? Who do you owe it to? Have you been keeping up with repayments, for example? Are there any debts that have progressed to the debt collection stage? What have you done so far to tackle that debt? Bringing all that information together before you start the conversation is certainly a good, solid platform to start that conversation for. And then I would say, understand what it is you need. What do you actually want to get from this conversation with a loved one? Is it support in coming up with a plan to tackle the debt? Is it an accountability partner that you need? Are you in need of financial advice? Be clear on what your needs and objectives are here. So that when you initiate that conversation with your loved one, not only can you can share your situation with them, but also you can tell them how they can support you on that debt journey. So understanding what you need out of that conversation is the second thing I would say that is very important. I think also a practical thing that is important here is find the right time for that conversation. It's challenging to initiate a conversation about debt. There's no two ways about that. And there's possibly never really the right time to start the conversation. But that said, while there isn't a right time to have the conversation, there can undoubtedly be some wrong times to have that conversation. So, find a private space to talk, ensure that you'll have sufficient time for that conversation and you're not going to be interrupted. And also choose a time when you're on good terms. And that can be with a current partner, or it could be perhaps you're in the middle of a relationship breakdown. Make sure you're on good terms if you can when you have that conversation, because it can become pretty emotional conversation for all parties concerned. So finding that right time and the right environment, I would say that's important as well. And I think the last thing I would counsel would be to, and it's a bit of a cliche in a way, but keep it real. If you're speaking to a loved one, it's pretty natural to want to protect them from the truth. But doing this is not going to help you in the long run. So be open and transparent, share the complete picture of your debt with them. That will give them a full view of where you are, and it will help equip them to support you. So, an example, let me bring that to life a little bit. The advice a loved one might give you if you were £5,000 in debt could be significantly different from the advice they would give you if you were £25,000 in debt. So be prepared to be open and transparent with them. Don't share any partial truths. Being vocal and honest about the debt situation you're in is absolutely vital. So those are sort of four of the things that I really think that Debt Awareness Week helps to sort of highlight how we can have these difficult conversations. We know it's not going to be easy. We know that it's going to be an emotional roller coaster, but there are certainly structured steps you can take to make that conversation more positive for you and to have the outcome that is going to help you move through this difficult point in your life as far as money is concerned.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I think they're four very practical steps in terms of breaking down that stigma and making it
Yeah.
seem like a thing that people can actually do. I guess it's important to be upfront and honest as well, because if you're not, that could then lead to having another conversation later on, which I'd imagine would be even more difficult if you've not been
Very
upfront
much
and
so.
honest.
That difficult first step, don't underestimate how difficult it's going to be for a lot of people. But by preparing yourself, by choosing the right time, by making sure that you've got all your information to hand and to know what you want to achieve out of that conversation, doing those things first is certainly going to have a positive impact on that conversation when you are looking for that support or to share the troubles that you feel that you're in with your partner or your loved one. Very important.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of practical steps then to start managing debt yourself and taking on that responsibility, is there anything that people can do to make managing their existing debt a little bit easier and ways to go about that?
Okay, well, I think there is something that I'd probably focus on here. There is a couple of things. First of all, is I would always link budgeting into this conversation. Budgeting is something that actually not that many households do as a formal exercise. And for those of us who make a half-hearted attempt at it, it doesn't often work. But in order to get an absolute clear overview of your current situation and what you've got coming in and what you've got going out, Setting up a budgeting process on a regular basis is something that can really help you tackle the situation you're in. And the second thing I would say is around prioritization of bills. Which bills should you be tackling first? If you're struggling at the end of the month or at the end of a week or a quarter or whatever it might be to meet all your commitments, the consequences of missing some types of bill can be more serious than if you fall behind on others. So if you are struggling to pay, whether it's rent, your mobile phone, or a loan repayment, we can certainly support you here at the Money and Pension Service. And if you're having trouble keeping track of your spending, budgeting and understanding bill priorities can certainly make it easier for you to list, sort out your expenses so you can see exactly where your money is going. So going back to that prioritization piece there, Tom, certain bills are priority bills. Your rent, your mortgage, utilities, council tax, etc. However, some bills are not priorities. It doesn't mean that you don't still need to think about paying them back if you're struggling, but things like your mobile phone bill, things like streaming services, for example, these are non-priority bills. So if you are at that point where you're struggling to balance and you know that you're going to have a shortfall, do have a look, for example, at our bill prioritization tool, which can really help you understand which ones to focus on first, which ones are the absolute important bills to deal with, and in what order to deal with them. And a lot of people just don't realize a lot of people just think, well, all sort of bills are equal. Well, they're not really. Some are going to have more serious ramifications if you don't meet them than others. So it's well worth understanding that process around prioritizing your bills and also looking at your budgeting situation, exactly what you've got coming in and coming out. Those two things combined can really help bring some clarity to your thoughts and help you understand the situation that you're in. Choose the bills you're worried about. Second step, get help on how to deal with those and which ones to tackle first. That's what I would say around that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. We'll make sure that bill prioritization tool is linked in the description of this episode as well.
Great.
Also, on our website, we have a simple to use budget planner as well, so that could be a great way for people to get started.
Absolutely, yeah. There are. We have one. Yeah, I know you've got one on your website, as you've alluded to. And if people do need some help to start budgeting, it doesn't have to eat up hours of their month. It can be done, just on a regular basis. It really gives you a bit more confidence as to where you're currently at and what your next few months might look like.
Brilliant. So, in terms of actually then seeking help and actually looking for that support, what support is actually available for people struggling with their existing debt?
Okay, so the first thing that I would absolutely say is if you are struggling with your existing debt, is speak to a free debt advisor. Debt advice is free and regulated in England. It's a little bit different in the devolved nations, but it is really important to engage early with a confidential debt advice program, either over the phone or face-to-face near where you live. And remember, a debt advisor is going to treat everything that you say in confidence. They won't judge you. They won't make you feel bad about your situation. They'll suggest ways of dealing with your debts that you might not know about. And they can also help you check, for example, if you've applied for all the benefits and entitlements that might be available for you. It really is important to get free debt advice if you're worried that you're going to miss a priority payment, you've already missed one, or you're facing some emergency issues. Organisations out there, Citizens Advice, Step Change, Christians Against Poverty, some really, really good organisations who are absolutely at the forefront of ethical debt advice. If you're not sure where to go, we have a service called Debt Advice Location. that you can come to us at the Money and Pension Service via Money Helper, our website. We can make sure that you get in touch with an appropriate free regulated debt advisor. So that's the first thing I would say. Something else people might not be aware of, there is a government scheme called Breathing Space. Breathing Space is designed to give you time to receive debt advice and find a solution to sort out your debt problems. And there are two different types of breathing space. There is a standard breathing space, which is where most creditors will have to stop their collection and enforcement of your debts if you are in that breathing space program. Those creditors will also have to freeze interest and charges on any eligible debts. And we can provide information on which debts can be included in that breathing space section. There is also a mental health crisis breathing space that can provide extra protection for people who are receiving mental health crisis treatment. In terms of eligibility, to be eligible for standard breathing space, you need to live in England or Wales. You must be unable to repay some or all of your debts as they fall due. You cannot be an undischarged bankrupt or in an IVA or a debt relief order, and you can't have used the scheme in the last 12 months. You will need to apply for that breathing space through that approved debt advisor. And that debt advisor must agree with you that you need some time to get debt advice and that you are likely to enter a debt solution. But certainly those two areas, free debt advice, breathing space, come to us if you want to know more about that. But it is really important that you understand that there is help out there. And we very much would like people to engage with that so that we can support them through what's a tough time.
Okay, so that's some really good debt advice and ways of people can get that support if they're struggling. I'm sure there's lots of less good support out there as well, particularly online. So is there anything that listeners should know about when seeking advice online and anything to avoid?
Yes, there is, and this is a difficult area in some ways because poor debt advice is pulling some people into inappropriate, particularly IVAs, individual voluntary arrangements. They are a type of fee charging debt solution. They're widely marketed to people with unmanageable debts. And whilst in some circumstances an IVA will be appropriate for somebody's situation, they are risky remedies that can attach high fees. And where people are unable to keep up with repayments, they can fail, leaving people in a worse position than when they're started. What we are seeing, for example, on social media, Tom, is a significant volume of advertising, a lot of it driven by AI algorithms that are targeting people who those algorithms perceive as vulnerable. And they are targeting them with adverts for unethical debt advice solutions. Whilst some of those organisations that I mentioned a moment ago, Citizens Advice, etc., will come up, for example, in internet searches or will come up on social media platforms, actually an awful lot of the companies that come up will be commercial entities who are looking to charge a fee, are looking to sell an individual's details on to an inappropriate debt advisor. And we very much want people to steer clear of that. We know that IVAs, for example, they're unlikely to be suitable for people with low levels of debt, people without much disposable income, or people whose income solely comes from benefits. And there's a really worrying trend that we're seeing at the moment about some of these companies making false claims about debt advice and IVAs. Some of them we've seen, they're posing as charities on social media. They're putting the Money Helper or Money and Pension Service logo on there. And these are all tactics to lure people into an IVA debt solution, which they simply can't afford. So, what I would say to anybody listening here is don't take anything without a proverbial pinch of salt, particularly on social media. You will see a lot of paid advertisements, and they will say things like, oh, we can write off 95% of your debts, become debt free in X period of time, free initial consultation, all this sort of stuff. Be very, very careful, because a lot of those companies will be wanting to lead you down the road to an IVA, an individual voluntary arrangement, that will not be suitable for many listeners. And it's important to understand that these companies, whilst they're legally trading, they aren't actually offering a solution for many people that is going to help them out of the difficult position that they're in. So just be very careful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I think it's something that's probably realistically only going to get worse until I think there's a reasonable solution to fixing that on the social media platforms.
Yes, I think so. It's a difficult one to police. We had we've had an engagement, shall we say, over the last couple of years with Google, trying to say to them, look, there are organisations advertising on your platform who are not providing solutions or debt advice solutions for people in vulnerable circumstances that we consider appropriate. And what are you going to do about that? Uh, and we've nearly sort of reached the end of that conversation. What happens from that, I won't know. I don't know. But the debt advice advertising is absolutely rife right across the internet and right across social media. So just, my advice would be, don't take everything you read as given. And just because on TikTok somebody's given a 30-second video that says, I can write all your debt off, take it with a pinch of salt, because the likelihood is that they can't.
Yeah, it's good advice. I guess anyone can appear as an expert on TikTok, can't they? So,
Absolutely,
yeah,
yes.
we don't want that. So for anyone who's listening then who may be an individual struggling with debt, or an employer looking to help their employees or colleagues,
Yeah.
how can the Money and Pension Service actually help these people?
Okay, well, our consumer-facing name, if you like, is Money Helper. We find that any organisation that has the word pensions in its title, people tend to run for the hills, Tom. So moneyhelper.org.uk is our main website. On there, you will find a lot of impartial, free, and independent guidance around some of the areas that we've touched upon in this podcast in the last 20 minutes or so. You will also find that debt advice locator tool. So let us help you in touch, get you connected in with a debt advisor near to you or over the phone that suits your circumstances and can actually help you get the right solution for you and for your family. You can also pick up the phone and call us. We're not just a digital service. We have a free phone number, which I'm going to plug here, which is 0800 138 7777. We have an awful lot of in-house experts who are there to help you deal with any money problems, any money troubles that you've got, including problem debt. So pick up the phone or engage with us through Money Helper. And that is our role. That is what we are funded to do. And that is to help people who are having money troubles.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Again, any useful links, we'll make sure they're in the description for people to access as well. So finally, just before we wrap up, for anyone who's listened to this and is interested about learning more about what we've talked about today, is there anywhere where you recommend people to go to learn a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if people want to know a bit more about debt and actually some of the issues around it, then Money Helper is your main port of call for that. But alternatively, go to Citizens Advice, look on their websites. Step Change is a fantastic organisation, and all these organisations, including ourselves, we are there to provide in jargon-free language what debt advice consists of, what that journey might look like for an individual, and how you can get support. So any one of those organisations, will very much provide you, if you want to have a cup of coffee and read up a bit more. Perhaps it's something you're worried about. Perhaps it's something you're thinking about doing, but you're not quite at that point yet. Come to Money Helper, Citizens Advice, Step Change, any one of those organisations will be more than happy to share their support and help you get started with that conversation and that debt advice.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has given a lot of different points of view and a lot of ways for individuals who are struggling, or even people who know someone who's struggling, to get that support that really is going to help them and be relevant to their situation. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're
Is there
welcome.
anything that you wanted to say before wrapping up?
Well, just thank you very much for having me on. And the last thing I would just say is just to reiterate something I said 10 minutes ago. It can be a very difficult situation at any point in life, but there is free help available. And I would urge anyone, share this far and wide, right from the podcast, family, friends, neighbours. If anyone's struggling in debt, don't suffer in silence. Please reach out and seek help.
Thanks, Paul. Great message for Debt Awareness Week this week. So thank you very much for joining us. To those of you listening, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If this is your first or you haven't already, please do make sure to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date with all of our latest episodes. We've got some great episodes planned over the next couple of months, so keep an eye out for them. But until the next episode, thanks very much for listening and have a great day.